now. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair, he has been speaking out on the climate debate, he reckons. And I've got to say, I actually agree with him on this point, but what he's saying is that we're doing all this net zero stuff here. All of us are having to incur extra costs on various different bits and pieces. And what is the point of it? And actually, we do all this, eat less meat, drive different cars, tinker with our boilers and whatever it is, so on and so forth. But if China changed nothing, then it's all a little bit irrelevant, is it not? Kerry, I'll start with you on this one. I agree with him. Do you think he makes a good point or not?
Well, I think a lot of things that we're doing are nonsense, and I do think we should have a referendum on net zero, because I think most of that is nonsense. But he's also fact-light, is Blair, because China leads the way. It's the world leader in solar panels. It's got access and is now the world leader in rare earth minerals. That's what they need to make batteries. It's head of the game in electric cars. So even though overall China has more emissions because of its vast population, it's way ahead on the climate change front. So it's very fact-like what he's saying. And the thing is that Blair, I can't believe a word he says, to be honest, but he is pontificating on the world stage and trying to find ways to, I think, back Starmer after the Uxbridge revolt over ULEZ, really. And I think you've got to understand that Blair isn't someone who questions the austerity measures that come with the apocalypse nightmare that we're supposed to be facing, which I think is rubbish. He goes along with those things. I was in Ghana when Blair was going around Africa telling poor people they shouldn't have what we have with his sustainababble, you know.
But it is whatever they're doing that's good, and I'm sure it's all fascinating, but the facts do remain that they do produce about 28% of the world's global emissions when it comes to carbon dioxide, and that is a problem. And I guess this is his point. We're all being told, add this onto your bill for green levies here, eat less meat, we're going to do this with your cars and all the rest of it. For what? Because if those emissions don't come down, then it is kind of irrelevant.
But there's also, I think there's another... we have to dig, I think, further beneath the surface, not just look at the amount of emissions, because global warming, in some regards, has got positive benefits. You know, there are far less deaths from heat than the 60,000 deaths that happen from cold, for example, that happened between 2000 and 2019. You know, 60-odd thousand deaths from cold, 2,000 from heat. Global warming can be good, and carbon emissions are necessary in terms of a greener planet. So we should just calm down about climate change. I'm not a climate change sceptic or denier, but I think we should get it in perspective and think about what do we want? What sort of society do we want? And what do people need? And that is more energy, more development globally, ability to grow our economy so we can better meet people's needs, and less of this hysteria about apocalyptic climate change, whether it's on a global level.
Global boiling, I heard it called today, not global warming, global boiling. Paul, your thoughts?
I think the problem, every now and then, Tony Blair, who's clearly not an unintelligent guy and is a good political operator, he will come out with something where it's quite profound and it's quite sensible, and you think people really ought to listen to him. I think the difficulty the guy's got, to be blunt, is I think Iraq has pretty much destroyed his credibility largely. So whenever he does, you know, hold forth on great global issues like this, people are just inclined to go, yeah, but you took us into that disastrous war in Iraq. It was an absolute calamity, the biggest foreign policy blunder in this country since Suez, arguably including Suez. So we're not going to listen to you, mate. So in that...
But people do listen to him because the Tony Blair Institute is huge. It has something like 60 million revenue last year. It's got hundreds of staff. They talk about being embedded in government.
Some people within the upper echelons of society undoubtedly do listen to him. I think some of them, including in the Labour Party, would like to see him back in charge, to be perfectly honest. And
would you?
No, I certainly wouldn't. And foreign governments as well, I think, you know, especially on the continent, will listen to him. But I do think he's right on this, that we need to be careful about inflicting a huge amount of punishment on ourselves when, in fact, in terms of global emissions, what we actually produce and what we might save in terms of global emissions is going to be a drop in the ocean on a global level. So I think there's an argument to say, look, why are we putting the country through this? And mainly it's going to be ordinary people who are going to pay the price of it. When we know renewables are unreliable, when we could go to a cliff edge transition, all of that, what that might mean in terms of jobs and industries going out of business and the lights going out and people not being able to heat their houses and stuff. So there does seem to be this kind of mad rush. And the way that I would describe it is, you know, I think we should all be environmentalists. I'm as green as the next person, but where we should have embraced, if you like, moderate environmentalism, what we've done is we've embraced militant environmentalism.
But do you do all your recycling, and do you do all the stuff that you should be doing to make yourself as kind of, whatever the word is, carbon neutral or whatever it is?
Yeah, I do what I think most families probably do in this country. You know, I'll recycle and
why do we need to be
I'll make sure I turn the lights
Paul?
off if no one's using them. And
there's no movement to destroy the planet. There's nobody around, no viewer will be thinking, oh, I'd really like to screw things up for the environment. That doesn't exist. So why be an environmentalist? Well, you know, is the world really about to, you know, expire?
No, and that's not my point.
So why are we... Not. You're right. We are being put through, you know, green austerity. What on earth for?
For the greater good. So some would argue, the environmentalists would sit here and say that actually, if they would argue that man-made climate change is a thing, and if man make changes to their habits and their behaviours right now, then for the greater good in the long term, that will be a positive thing.
I think for the greater good in the long term, is an anthropomorphic effect, there is a human effect, what we need is more money, more development, so that we can offset the effects, so that we can have, if we need them, air conditioning, so that we can have, you know, nicer vehicles and better development. So, you know what I mean? So it's development that can offset these problems. People at the moment are dying in Algeria and Tunisia. They're not dying in the more developed parts of the world where there's a heat wave. And that's purely about development.
What do you make to it all? I've got to say that there's a few people here saying they share your view about Tony Blair and his credibility and all the rest of it. I always struggle to listen to climate lectures about how much I have to change my life, whether it's the cars or the food or whatever it is, my flying or whatever. I always struggle to take advice from people that think it's absolutely cool to get into private jets and go jetting around the world, to have conferences and conversations with their best friends and their allies and all the rest of it. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just being a little bit childish, but there's just something about that, because if you want me to change my habits, then why don't you lead by example? That's what I always think.